ветра, и танки наши быстрые, и наши люди мужества полны. В строю стоят советские танкисты, своей великой родины цели. Гремя огнем, сверкая блеском стали, пойдут машины в яростный поход. Когда на бой пошлет товарищ Сталин, и первый маршал волю поведет. Когда на бой пошлет товарищ Сталин, и первый маршал волю поведет.
The bumper is solid as it is on all cars with a one-piece chassis. Since the real bumper is U or C-shaped, I decided to build a new one from copper sheet. There are a couple of different bumpers on actual cars. The differences are the holes and slots for attaching license plates. On this bumper, the support for the starter crank was bolted on the wrong way. Here it sits more to the bumper's rear edge, and that leaves us with a couple of possibilities to choose from. We can also see that the toe hook's tips are bent outwards. And this is the role model for the bumper I built. Actually, the two bumpers I built. There are only holes, no slots, and that makes it much easier to replicate this part. I transferred the positions of all holes from the reference pics to a piece of photo paper. The paper was used as template for marking the holes on the copper sheet. This way I only had to measure once. The holes were drilled with bits of different sizes to make the bumper look as realistic as possible. I scored the bumper silhouette onto the copper sheet. My scratch awl is one of the most important tools when I'm working with metal or plastic sheets. For the bending lines I used a bit more force. After cutting out the bumpers, I bent them into shape. This panel is bolted on top of the actual chassis front end, and the toe hooks sit on top of the panel. Since it's molded onto the kit's chassis, I had to rescue it for further use before I changed the front end. Here we have the parts I made to replace the chassis front portion. And here's the panel I talked about. The complete panel was sanded a bit thinner from the underside. After that, I sanded the areas that would sit on top of the chassis real thin. I guess they weren't thicker than 0.2 millimeters after I was finished. This 0.4 millimeter styrene strip is as wide as the chassis. By gluing it to the bumper's inside, I was able to use plastic cement to glue it to the chassis. The height of the new front end wasn't quite right. I added strips of 0.4 mm styrene to the upper and strips of 0.2 mm styrene to the underside. Then they were sanded down till they had the correct height. The gaps between the new front end and the chassis were filled with small pieces of styrene. Filling was done with liquid CA glue. The holes in the plate are the locators for the toe hooks, but I filled them because they weren't needed anymore. The support for the starter crank had to be scratch built too because it's missing in the kit. I used a 4x2 mm piece of 0.2 mm copper sheet. The bending line sits in the center. For the crank slot I drilled a 0.6 mm hole. Then I made small cuts into the copper on both sides of the hole. By sanding off the ridges from the other side, I got the slots I wanted. 2.4 mm holes were drilled into the part that would be bolted onto the bumper. It was necessary to drill them a bit larger than the holes on the bumper because I wasn't sure if all 4 holes would align properly. This way I had some room for adjustments. At first I glued pieces of 0.3 mm copper wire into the holes on top of the bumper. The glue was applied from the inside to retain a flat surface on the outside. Then the support was glued into place. The bumper is 1.5 mm wide and the support is 2 mm wide. Again, I wanted to be able to adjust this apart before gluing it into place. I cut it flush with the bumper after the glue had cured. Then I cut the wire to length, and here's the result. Time to glue the bumper to the chassis. I used a 0.6mm hose on top of the bumper to locate the positions for the matching holes on the chassis. After I drilled these holes, I used 0.6mm copper wire to bolt the bumper to the chassis. The wire's ends were cut off after the glue had cured. This makes for a very strong bond, and you'd have to rip off the complete front end to remove the bumper. Next parts were the braces. I had ordered 0.1mm brass sheet, and it arrived the day before I started working on these parts. I cut 2 strips of 2x10mm and scored bending lines at 2mm from both ends. Then I drilled 4 holes of 0.6mm each for the bolts that were used to attach the braces to bumper and chassis. The bending was done, and now the parts could be glued into place. That was much more difficult than I had expected, and my sausage fingers proved to be the greatest obstacle. In the end, I was able to glue both braces and the bolts into place, and I liked the result. And now for the tow hooks. Here are a couple of reference pics. And here are the kids' tow hooks. We should keep the kids' age in mind, but it was clear that I wouldn't use these hooks after all the work I had put into the chassis up to this point. I had built such a hook before, and so it wasn't that difficult to do it again. I used 1mm copper wire that was flattened out on one end by squeezing it with flat pliers. Then it was sanded roughly into shape. Next step was bending the hooks and sanding them a little more. After I had cut off the hooks, I flattened out the ends of the bottom pieces. The positions for the bolts were marked, but this time I didn't drill holes. The bottom sections were sanded into shape, and the tips were bent outwards to give them the look of the actual hooks. I used CA glue to attach the hooks to the chassis front end. I had some stretched sprue left that I used to replicate the bolts. I used CA glue again, and after curing I cut off the sprue at the appropriate length. Here you see a couple of pics of actual hitches. The kit part looks quite nice and comes close to the real hitch, but it's way too big. My idea was to use it, but to sand it down on all sides to bring it closer to the actual size. That included removing the better part of the hitch's rear. The kit part is solid, but this part of the actual hitch is open, so this had to be changed. This was necessary to bolt the hitch to the tongue. As you saw, the hitch can pivot up and down in order to allow towing trailers or light cannons cross-country. Since I had sanded off all race details, I had to rebuild a couple of them. The bushings for the pivot are 2 of those details. I had drilled 0.8mm holes in the appropriate positions. Then I inserted 2 short pieces of stretched tubing. The bushings were drilled out to 0.5mm for the copper wire I used as pivot. The receiver was too wide and had to be changed. I used 3 pieces of 0.2mm styrene sheet, and that's the weakest part of this hitch. I'm not 100% happy with the result, but you'll be able to judge for yourself in a couple of seconds. Next thing to do was building a new hitch pin, since I had removed the molded-on pin. Again I used styrene tubing that is stretched like a dude with pieces of sprue. The tubing remains tubing no matter how thin you stretch it out. Here you see one end of the tubing. It's got a diameter of 0.8 millimeters. The hole I drilled is necessary for the hairpin that secures the hitch pin. This part of the tubing was drilled out to accommodate the thinner part of the hitch pin. Both parts were assembled before I cut off the thicker end. I used CA glue because I didn't want the parts to melt by the use of plastic cement. It was also used to fill the opening on top of the pin. Next I built a ring to attach chain and hairpin to the hitch. That's the smallest chain I have and the links are 0.8 by 1.5 millimeters. It looks way too big on the hitch. I took care of it a little later, but now I wanted to see what the hitch would look like with the hairpin put into place. Apart from the bulky chain, I was quite happy. The car's rear end and the locator for the hitch. The plate was too wide and so I sanded it off. Then I removed some styrene from the rear to make it thinner. The actual part is welded to the chassis, so the rear end has an open area to accommodate the plate. I outlined that area by scribing its shape into the rear end. Then I cut out a matching part of 0.4mm styrene sheet, drilled the hole and glued it into place. And then I wanted to find out if I could scratch build a hitch. First I measured and drew the shape of the vertical side parts onto a piece of 0.5mm styrene sheet. Then I drilled 0.8mm holes in the receiver's corners. One more hole each was drilled for the bushings. I cut out the parts and made the receiver from 0.2mm copper sheet. This part had to be sanded into its final shape after bending it and gluing it into place. One of the side parts was glued into place to indicate the space I had left to work with. The receiver's middle sections are thicker than the edges. I glued strips of 0.4mm styrene onto the horizontal and vertical surfaces. The comparison between kit and scratch build part shows that the new hitch is bigger and maybe it's too big. Nonetheless, I wanted to finish this piece. Instead of using a chain to secure the hairpin, I used a short piece of cable. You saw that it was done like that on one of the two reference pics. The cable comes from a broken USB cable that I had stripped. Very useful stuff and definitely worth keeping it. Time to build the hitch's tongue. I had ordered brass tubing of 4 different gauges for another project, but I found it to be perfect for the use as tongue. The 1.5mm tubing was what I used for the tongue. I cut off a 3mm piece by rolling it gently and without any pressure under the blade of this cheap hobby knife. The small ridge around the tubing's opening can easily be removed with a matching drill bit, in this case 1.1mm. I wanted the tongue to be movable because the actual tongue can rotate. I needed a ring I could glue to the end of the tubing. The best material that came to mind was the styrene tubing you saw several times before. The opening has a diameter of about 1mm, but since the tubing is 2.3mm, it wasn't difficult to drill it out to 1.5mm. I used CA glue to assemble both tubings. After the glue had cured, I cut off the styrene tubing the same way I had done it with the brass tubing. All that was left to do was sanding off the excess styrene. The tongue fits precisely, and here are a couple of pics with my scratch-built hitch bolted on. This is just dry fitting. I used a scrap piece of 0.5mm copper wire. I doubt that much of the things I did here will be visible. Well, I'll have pics to look at and videos to watch, so it wasn't completely in vain. The kit's rear end hasn't much in common with that of the actual GAZ. Since I put many hours of work into the model so far, I just couldn't leave this as it was. I measured the kit's chassis width and that of the drawing. Now I was able to calculate all the measurements I needed. I don't have a digital caliper yet, so I was limited to half millimeters. This isn't overly precise, but it's good enough to make the chassis look more like the real one. The moment of truth and bravery. Cutting off the parts that aren't correct. The new crossmember should be 1.5 millimeters wide, but I don't have styrene of that thickness. I laminated one piece of 1 millimeter and one of 0.5 millimeters. After sanding it, I glued it into place. Tiny gaps were filled with CA glue. Next task was building the bolster. Its frame was made of 4 strips of 1 millimeter styrene. I could have built the coil spring from a straight piece of 0.5 millimeters and wrapped it with some 0.3 millimeter copper wire. I decided that I'd use a short piece of brass wound guitar string. I stripped about 2 millimeters on one end. That end was inserted in the hole I had drilled into one of the bolster's short sides. Both ends were glued to the small frame. The stripped end received a knot of styrene tubing. The bolster's position was marked on the chassis rear end and then it was glued into place. The mounts for the rear leaf springs are wrong. Tamiya molded them onto the top edge of the chassis, but they belong on the bottom edge. Before I took care of that, I finished the rear end. The best thing about it was that the top still fitted on the chassis and the new parts didn't interfere. One of the last bits to do on this part of the build was adding these two braces from 0.2 mm styrene sheet. The holes for the bolts and former blank holes were drilled and the bolts were glued into place. Here you can compare my work to what the actual cast chassis looks like. For me that was close enough to reality. And now we'll take a closer look at the mounts for the rear leaf springs. There'll be parts you can see quite well behind the rear wheels after the model is finished. I simply had to change the kit chassis. It was clear that I wouldn't be able to do a 100% correct rendition of the actual suspension, but I wanted to come as close as possible. My eyes and hands would set the limit. Getting old often sucks. For the rear mounts I used my trusty 2.3 mm styrene tubing again, but I used what you maybe would throw away. I used the conical parts that are the result of stretching sprues or tubing. I sanded it flat at 2 different levels. The leaf springs would be mounted to the level at the tip. The other level would be attached to the chassis. I made 2 clumps of copper sheet that were glued to the mounts and would make for more stability. The clamps were glued to the mounts before cutting them off the tubing. That way it was easier to hold onto both parts and align them as precisely as possible. Here are a couple of pics with the first mount glued into place. And here you can compare the new part to what Tamiya had done. And and now both new parts glued into place. The front mounts for the rear leaf springs look different, and I used 2x2mm square rod to build them. These mounts were also sanded flat at 2 levels. While the rear mounts already had matching holes for attaching the leaf springs, it was necessary to drill them here. The edges were sanded. The chassis had to be changed a bit because it was curved where the new parts had to be attached. 2 more copper clamps were needed. Your last chance to look at the kit's mounts. And the result. You may have guessed that this wasn't all I changed here, but you'll have to wait for part 3 to find out. Although I love old cars, I never saw shock absorbers like these before. Since the styrene tubing's diameter was too big, I decided to use 1.5mm brass tubing. The main cylinders would be 4.5mm long. Here I marked and drilled holes to attach locators for the mounting brackets I had to build. I explained how to cut brass tubing a couple of minutes ago. The locators are made from 0.6mm copper wire. There's a smaller cylinder perpendicular on top of the main cylinder. I made them by stretching styrene tubing very slowly. Then I used a round file for removing some styrene where main and small cylinder would be glued together. The shock's levers or swing arms are hinged to the small cylinders, so I inserted short pieces of 0.5mm copper wire as pivots. The main cylinders were closed with 1mm copper wire from both ends. The actual shocks can be adjusted with the bolts in these wedges. The mounting brackets were made from copper sheet. One of the holes is for the locator I had built on the shock absorbers. The other hole is blank and only received a short piece of copper wire. I didn't like the first attempt of building the wedges because they were too chunky. For the second attempt I used parts of half the size. That was much better. I assembled all the parts I had made so far. Then it was time to build the shock's swing arms. I made 2 washers from thin copper wire. The nuts were thin slices of styrene tubing I had sanded down a bit. It doesn't matter that much that they have different sizes because they'll be invisible. The swing arms will remain functional until the rear axle is finished and glued into place. At first I was a bit confused about where to glue the shocks, but the pics were very helpful. They sit on the rear portion of the curved area of the chassis. I was quite amazed and happy when I found out that everything would fit well. That was much more than I had expected and hoped for. Let's compare the kid's chassis to this drawing of the actual one. Tamiya made a big mistake with the chassis shape. That was something I didn't want to change because it would be too much work on an area you can't see on the finished model. What I did want to change were these support brackets. I didn't change the angle of the front brackets but the thickness. Maybe it would have been less work to sand the vertical parts thinner, but there's an issue that wouldn't have been changed by doing that. While you're watching what I did, I'll tell you more about that issue. Tamiya molded 2 half-round cutaways into the support brackets on the right-hand side. They are necessary to accommodate the kid's exhaust, or more precisely, the exhaust's muffler. They aren't necessary for the actual exhaust because that's not the muffler's place. There is no muffler along the chassis. You'll see more of it in the next parts of this mini-series. I must say that large parts of the kit's chassis are rather fantasy than reality. You'll also see the finished brackets because there was a bit more work to do. Here's what the chassis looks like up to now. Of course it isn't finished yet. This corner had to be changed because the flap has a cutaway and wouldn't cover this bit. It was a bit fiddly, but that's what you get for not paying enough attention. The clamps were sitting too far to the front, so I had to build new ones. They had to be smaller to fit where they belong. The simple leaf springs I had built in the first part had to go because they just wouldn't fit anymore. They were replaced with 2 short pieces of copper wire. Funny how things happen sometimes. I was talking about the Schwimmwagen with my good friend Dan Nispel. He had ordered one and I told him how much I'd love to build the new Tamiya kit. 2 days later my friend Jack said he would send me the kit. How did he know about it? That was really nice and thoughtful, Jack. Thank you very, very much. I haven't decided yet if I'll use the kit's wheels or buy one of these sets. As you know, I bought DEF.Model wheels for the GAZ and I really like them. It depends on the dia or vignette I'll choose to build for the Schwimmwagen, but that's still a secret. I bought this Eastern Express kit for a challenge, but something went terribly wrong. After opening the box I found out that the kit is a challenge, but I'll show you what I mean in an inbox review.
That's all, folks.